The silent Heiress, the galaxy was vast, filled with wonders beyond imagination. But in the shining towers of the Orion conglomerate, there lived a young girl who had never known the sound of her own voice. She was the only daughter of the alien billionaire Tyrax Vaylor, a man feared and respected across star systems. His wealth could move markets, his fleets could silence rebellions, and his word was law. Yet, in the heart of his palace was a single weakness he could never conquer: his daughter's silence. From the moment of her birth, the Heiress was different. Her large, luminous eyes, her pale skin glowing faintly under the stars, and the small, delicate ears that never caught a single sound. She grew up watching the world move around her without ever hearing it. The rustle of the wind, the hum of the great ships, even the voice of her father. Everything was locked away in silence. Doctors, engineers, and even telepathic healers had been called to restore her hearing. Some offered implants, others tried neural surgery. Some even promised miracles through forbidden science. But each attempt ended in failure. What remained were faint scars around her ears, marks of countless disappointments. The Heiress lived behind golden walls, walking through marble corridors lit with starlight crystals, but her life was lonely. The galaxy saw her as a secret, hidden away by her father who could not bear the shame of weakness in his bloodline. To the public she was a mystery, a whispered rumor. To the Council of Alien Lords she was a liability, a child unfit to inherit. And to herself, she was a prisoner inside a silent cage. Every day she moved through the palace with slow grace, her long gowns brushing the floor, her bare feet soft against the polished marble. Servants bowed, guards stood at attention, but none dared speak to her. What was the use? She could not hear their words. Some pitied her, others mocked her in secret, saying the Empire's heiress was broken, cursed by the stars. But she ignored them, her eyes fixed always on the stars beyond the great crystal windows. She dreamed of what sound might be. Was it thunder? Was it gentle like the rain she had never truly heard? Or was it sharp like the anger in her father's face? Her father loved her in his own way, but it was the love of a man obsessed with control. To him, her silence was an imperfection that had to be fixed. He poured fortunes into research, demanded answers from the galaxy's brightest minds, and punished those who failed him. But deep down, he knew there was no cure. And so he grew cold, visiting her less and less, burying himself in politics and power. The Heiress learned to live with loneliness, carrying it like a shadow. Despite her silence, she was not weak. She could read lips better than any machine. She could sense vibrations in the walls of the palace, and her instincts sharpened beyond measure. Many times she surprised her tutors by answering questions before they even finished writing them. She carried intelligence, but what she longed for was something simpler: connection. She wanted to hear someone laugh, to hear the voice of a friend, to listen to music instead of watching dancers move in silence. At night, when the palace grew quiet, she wandered alone. She would sit by the towering crystal windows, her hands pressed to the glass as she looked at the stars. She imagined what it would be like to hear them sing, because she had once read that stars themselves made music, faint sounds carried across space. She closed her eyes and tried to picture what sound felt like, but it always slipped away. And in that silence, fear grew. She feared that her life would always remain this way, closed off from the galaxy. She feared she would never inherit her father's empire, that her cousins and rivals would take it from her. She feared she would never know what her own voice sounded like. Yet beneath all that fear was something stronger, a small ember of hope. She did not know why she carried it, but it stayed alive inside her, whispering that someday, someone might bring light into her silent world. The galaxy's greatest dynasties believed that only advanced science could save her. The richest empires dismissed humans as weak and primitive, unworthy of higher power. But destiny does not bow to money or machines, and destiny was already moving quietly through the palace corridors, wearing the uniform of a lowly janitor, pushing a cart filled with rags and tools. The Heiress did not know his name yet. She had never even noticed him. But soon their worlds would collide in a way that no alien empire, no galactic council, no billion credits of science could have ever predicted. Her silence was about to end, and it would not be by technology, but by the touch of a human's hand. The human janitor beneath the shining towers of the alien palace, where golden halls touched the sky and marble floors reflected the starlight. There lived another story, one the galaxy never cared to see. In the lowest levels of the palace, hidden from the banquet halls and council chambers, walked a man who belonged to no great dynasty, no powerful empire, and no royal bloodline. He was a human, a single father, once a craftsman, now a janitor. His name was whispered by none, his presence ignored by all, yet his footsteps echoed quietly through corridors that had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. To the aliens, he was just another disposable servant, a creature assigned to sweep, scrub, and vanish when the nobles arrived. To himself, he was a man still carrying wounds that no one could see. He had once lived on Earth, a place far removed from the wealth and arrogance of the alien elite. Life had never been easy, but he had survived with dignity, working with his hands, building small devices and repairing broken things for neighbors who could not afford replacements. But what defined his soul was not his trade. It was his love for his daughter. She had been fragile, often sick, yet she was his light. He used to spend hours repairing old hearing aids for children in his town, just to see them smile when they could hear the world again. And when his daughter had laughed, even weakly, it gave him strength to face any hardship. But fate was cruel. A sickness stole her away from him before he could find a cure, and in that moment his world had gone hollow. He buried his pain deep, working without complaint, because survival did not allow him the luxury of breaking down. When alien recruiters came, offering labor contracts in exchange for money, he accepted, not because he wanted to leave Earth, but because he had nothing left to lose. They treated humans like cheap labor, assigning them to the dirtiest jobs in colonies and palaces, but he endured. His hands grew rough, his body grew tired, but his spirit never fully surrendered. Every night, while scrubbing endless corridors, he remembered the warmth of his daughter's hand and the way she had once rested her head on his chest to feel his heartbeat. That memory carried him through the silence of his new life. The aliens saw him as less than a shadow. Guards sneered at him as he passed. Nobles looked through him as though he did not exist, and even other servants avoided him, fearing punishment if they spoke to a human. Yet he continued, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies through the palace like a ghost. He cleaned the banquet halls after feasts, gathering scraps the nobles left behind, sometimes saving small pieces of food for himself. He polished crystal floors that reflected alien boots, but never his own worn shoes. He worked tirelessly because in his silence he believed that perhaps one day he would find meaning again. There was something different about him, something that not even the aliens could see. Though stripped of status, though pushed into the dirt of servitude, he carried within him the stubborn resilience of humanity. He still fixed small things when he could, repairing broken tools in the palace, tightening bolts, smoothing cracks with his hands. It was as if he could not stand the idea of leaving something broken, whether it was an object or a life. And even though his daughter was gone, he still carried her memory as if she was walking beside him. Sometimes, when he looked at the alien children passing through the palace, he felt his heart ache with memories of the girl he had lost. Yet destiny had a way of weaving paths together in silence. Each night, after hours of work, he passed by a corridor high above, where he could see the stars through great crystal windows. He often paused there, resting for a moment, remembering how his daughter once asked him what stars sounded like. He had told her they hummed like faint music. She had believed him, smiling with innocent faith. That memory was all he had left of her voice, and so he carried it, whispering it to himself in the quiet corridors of an alien palace that would never care for his pain. It was during one of these nights, as he leaned against his cart and wiped sweat from his brow, that fate began to turn. He did not yet know that the heiress of the Orion conglomerate often walked those same upper halls, restless in her silence. He did not know that her loneliness mirrored his own, or that she too stared at the stars, wondering what sound felt like. He did not know that their worlds, so far apart, would collide in a way that no machine or empire. He was only a janitor, a man forgotten by history. She was an heiress, hidden behind golden walls, but both carried silence inside them. Hers forced by nature, his carved by loss, and sometimes silence recognizes silence. Sometimes destiny waits for two broken worlds to cross paths. The galaxy thought him meaningless, but it was his hands, his calloused human hands, that carried something greater than all alien science combined. For within him lived the one gift the galaxy had forgotten, the power to heal through touch, the human way of fixing what was broken not with machines, but with compassion. He pushed his cart forward, unaware that the palace had already begun to weave their meeting. And soon the janitor and the heiress would find each other in the shadows of a palace that believed in nothing but wealth and power. Soon silence would tremble. The fateful encounter. The palace of Tyrax Valor was a place where servants were not meant to be seen, where humans were expected to vanish like shadows the moment noble eyes appeared. The janitor knew this rule better than anyone, for every day of his life inside those glittering halls reminded him of his insignificance. He kept his head down, his cart steady, his footsteps quiet. Yet destiny is not bound by rules, and on a night when the stars burned especially bright above the Orion spires, his path shifted. The heiress had wandered away from her chambers, restless in her silence. Her father's empire was celebrating some great victory, the palace filled with the laughter and boasting of alien lords. Music played in the halls below, though she could not hear it. She felt only the vibrations beneath her feet, a faint trembling against the marble floors, reminding her again of all she was denied. She moved through the upper corridor, her gown trailing like a silver river behind her, her bare fingers tracing the cold crystal walls. She always sought the stars, as if their distant light could comfort her. Tonight she wanted to feel less alone, and so she found herself in a part of the palace rarely touched by noble presence. It was there, by a wide crystal window, that she first noticed the man. A human, bent over his cart, sweat clinging to his brow, his rough hands busy with tools and cloth. She paused, curious. No alien servant had ever dared work in her presence without trembling, but this man seemed lost in his task, unaware that the heiress of the Orion conglomerate had entered his world. For a long moment, she simply watched him. His movements were precise, careful, not just cleaning but repairing a broken panel along the wall. She saw the way his hands adjusted a loose frame, the way he frowned slightly as though the task mattered deeply. It was strange. Aliens with far greater knowledge and wealth never touched things with such care. And though he wore the uniform of the lowest rank, his eyes carried something rare, a quiet strength, like someone who had known great loss yet still endured. The janitor finally looked up and froze. His heart raced as he realized who stood before him, the heiress, the girl everyone whispered about, the silent daughter of the most powerful man in the Orion conglomerate. Fear struck him like lightning. He knew the rules. Humans were forbidden from addressing nobles, forbidden from even lifting their eyes unless commanded. His instinct screamed to bow, to retreat, to vanish. Yet she did not move away. Instead, her luminous eyes studied him, not with arrogance or contempt, but with something else. Curiosity. She raised a hand, slowly, pointing at his cart, then at the broken panel he had fixed. Her lips shaped a silent question, though no sound followed. He understood instantly. She was asking what he had done. With trembling hesitation, he touched his chest, then gestured to the wall, trying to explain through motions that he had repaired it. To his surprise, she gave a small nod, her expression softening. No alien noble had ever looked at him that way, as if his work mattered. Then her eyes shifted, almost unwillingly, toward his ears. She touched her own scarred ones with delicate fingers, her gaze suddenly heavy with a silent plea. He understood, though he could hardly believe it. She was asking about her silence, about hearing, about what it meant to feel sound. His throat tightened. For a moment he wanted to walk away. What could he offer her? He was just a janitor, a broken man who had lost his own daughter. Yet something inside him stirred. The memory of his little girl on Earth, resting her head against his chest to feel his heartbeat, whispering about how stars must sound. The memory was too strong to ignore. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his hand. He pointed to his ears, then to hers, asking silently for permission. The heiress did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, her eyes wide, waiting. With a breath that shook his chest, he stepped closer, each heartbeat pounding in his ears like thunder. He lifted his calloused hand and, with the gentleness of a father, placed it softly against the edge of her alien ear. The world seemed to stop. The palace, the stars, the hum of distant engines, all faded into silence. And then something happened. Not sound, not exactly, but a vibration, deep and strange, pulsed through her. For the first time in her life, she felt something more than emptiness. It was faint, broken, almost like a whisper carried through stone, but it was real. Her eyes widened in shock, tears filling them as she stared at the human who dared to touch her. She clutched his wrist with trembling fingers, unwilling to let go, desperate to feel it again. The janitor's own eyes burned with emotion. He had seen this before, long ago, when he had given repaired hearing aids to children on Earth. That moment when silence cracked, when the impossible became possible. He had thought he would never feel it again. Yet here it was, alive in the eyes of an alien heiress. She did not speak. Her voice was still locked away, but she gasped, a sharp intake of breath that even she could faintly feel echo in her chest. Her tears fell freely now, not of sorrow but of something she had never dared to hope for, hope itself. She pressed his hand harder to her ear, shaking her head in disbelief, and for the first time in her life she laughed. Not a sound, not yet, but a silent, trembling laugh that shook her shoulders as light filled her face. The janitor knew the danger. If anyone saw him, if anyone knew what had just happened, he would be punished or worse. Yet, in that moment, he did not care, because in that single touch, he had given her a piece of the world, and she had given him something he thought was lost forever, a reason to believe again. And so, in a quiet palace corridor where no one was meant to see, the silent heiress and the forgotten janitor shared a secret that would change the galaxy. Neither spoke, neither could, but they both knew destiny had just taken its first breath. The Secret Sessions. After that night in the silent corridor, something changed within the heiress. For years, she had carried emptiness inside her, walking through life as if separated from the galaxy by an invisible wall. But now, a crack had appeared in that wall, and through it came the faintest echo of a world she had only imagined. The touch of the human janitor's hand had awakened something no alien doctor, no machine, no healer had ever given her. It was not perfect hearing, not even close, but it was real. She had felt vibrations, faint whispers of life that her heart translated into meaning. For the first time, she knew what it was to almost hear. She could not let it go. Every night after that encounter, she found herself returning to the same crystal corridor, waiting. At first, she worried he would not come back, that the palace guards had reassigned him or punished him for being where he should not have been. But each time, the soundless echoes of his footsteps would eventually reach her eyes, and she would see him again, pushing his cart, his tired face marked by shadows of a life harder than anyone deserved. He always paused when he saw her, hesitation filling his gaze, but her silent plea, her wide eyes, her trembling hands pointing to her ears, drew him forward, and so began their secret sessions. They did not speak, for words were impossible. Instead, they communicated through gestures, through expressions, through the quiet language of hands and eyes. He showed her simple things, how humans used signs to talk when words failed, how touch could carry meaning stronger than sound. He would tap his chest, then point at her, teaching her the meaning of me and you. She learned quickly, her intelligence shining as she absorbed every motion. Sometimes she would laugh silently at his clumsy attempts, and though he could not hear her laughter, he could feel it, see it in her eyes, and it warmed something inside him that had long grown cold. Each time he placed his hand upon her ears, the sensation returned. At first it was faint vibrations, but slowly, with each session, she began to sense more. She could feel the rhythm of footsteps in the hall, the steady hum of the palace engines, even the faint rustle of fabric when she moved her hands across her gown. One night she startled herself when a cup fell from her fingers and shattered against the floor. For the first time in her life, she felt the violent crash not only through her skin but deep inside her head, as if the sound itself had touched her. He watched her with quiet wonder. For him, this was more than a miracle. It was the return of something he thought he had lost with his daughter. In her wide eyes, he saw the same innocent amazement he had once seen when his little girl had worn her first repaired hearing aid. The memory nearly broke him, but instead of despair, it gave him strength. He realized that perhaps he had been brought here for a reason, that fate had placed him in this palace not to suffer, but to give one last gift to a child who needed him. But the sessions could not remain hidden forever. He knew the danger. If the guards discovered him in her presence, if the council learned that a lowly human janitor was touching the daughter of the most powerful billionaire in the Orion conglomerate, it would not end with punishment. It would end with death. Yet, each night he still came, because when he saw the heiress waiting by the window, her eyes glowing with anticipation, he could not turn away. For her, the silence was no longer complete. For him, the emptiness of his heart began to lift. The heiress guarded their secret fiercely. She told no one, not even her caretakers. She hid the growing strength in her senses, pretending she remained the same fragile, silent child the galaxy believed her to be. But in the hidden hours of the night, she came alive. She would gesture stories to him, pointing to the stars and miming questions. What sound did they make? What did thunder feel like? What did rain sound like when it touched the earth? And though he could not give her everything, he would answer with his hands, his expressions, and sometimes by pressing her hand to his chest so she could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat. She loved that most of all. To her, it was music. Slowly, she began to form her own sounds. Broken whispers, strange at first, but with his encouragement she continued. The first time a faint syllable escaped her lips, she froze in shock, clutching her mouth as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had not even known her body was capable of making such a noise. The janitor nodded firmly, smiling through his own tears, and she tried again, her lips trembling as another sound came. It was raw, imperfect, but it was hers. Night after night, the bond between them deepened. The heiress no longer looked at him as a servant, but as something far greater. He had become her teacher, her protector, the first being in her life who gave her something that all the wealth of her father's empire could not buy. To her, he was proof that humanity carried something beyond the reach of alien science. But destiny is never gentle. The longer their secret sessions continued, the greater the risk became. The palace was filled with eyes, and whispers had begun to stir that the heiress seemed different lately, her gaze brighter, her silence less heavy. The council began to ask questions. The servants muttered in corners, and though the heiress and the janitor did not yet know it, the storm was coming. Their secret was not built to last, and soon the galaxy would discover what they had done. For now, though in the quiet corridors lit by starlight, a human janitor and an alien heiress carved out a fragile miracle. She could almost hear, and he could almost feel alive again. And in those stolen moments, silence itself seemed to bend before them. The discovery. For many weeks their secret continued, hidden within the silent corners of the palace. The heiress grew bolder, her eyes brighter with each night as faint fragments of sound reached her through the janitor's touch. She began to laugh more, to gesture with excitement, and even dared to shape broken syllables into soft, trembling whispers. Every night she waited by the crystal window, her gown trailing like liquid silver, her heart racing with the anticipation that only he could bring. The janitor, though weary from endless hours of labor, never failed her. He would come quietly, pushing his cart, his hands rough and tired but carrying the gift that no alien empire could replicate, the gift of hope. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, always leave traces. The servants began to notice changes in the heiress. She moved with a confidence that had never been there before, her eyes sharper, her presence different. Rumors spread through the lower halls. Some whispered that she had found a cure in secret, others said she had been touched by some forbidden technology, and some even claimed that the silence had driven her mad. None of them imagined that a human janitor, a man they mocked and ignored, had been the cause of her transformation. Yet whispers are dangerous things, and in a palace built on pride and control, they soon reached ears that should never have heard them. One night, when the stars shone pale and the corridors echoed with the faint hum of alien ships overhead, the janitor once again stood with her by the crystal window. She pressed his hand to her ear, her eyes closing as she felt the faint pulse of vibrations through her skin. For her, it was like music, imperfect, fragile, but alive. She whispered something broken, a sound that made his chest tighten with pride. It was not a full word, but it was a step closer to speech. Her face glowed with joy, and for a moment the janitor forgot the danger that surrounded them. He forgot the palace walls, the cruel eyes of guards, the watchful gaze of her father. For a moment he believed this fragile miracle could last. But the moment shattered when the heavy footsteps of guards echoed from behind. The janitor froze, his hand still pressed to her ear. The heiress's eyes flew open, panic flashing across her face. A second later, the towering forms of alien guards appeared at the end of the corridor, their armor gleaming under the cold light. Their eyes narrowed at the sight before them. A human servant standing far too close to the daughter of Tyrax Valor, his hand on her as though he had the right to touch her. The guards surged forward, their voices sharp, barking accusations he could barely understand. The janitor stumbled back, his heart pounding. He tried to raise his hands in surrender, but rough claws grabbed him by the arms, wrenching them behind his back. Pain shot through him as they dragged him down to his knees. The heiress rushed forward, her gown flowing as she placed herself between him and the guards, her hands moving in frantic gestures, her face fierce with defiance. But the guards ignored her, shoving her aside as if she were nothing more than a child having a tantrum. She screamed then, not a silent scream, but a sound. A broken, raw cry that tore itself from her throat and echoed through the corridor. It was not graceful or perfect, but it was real, filled with desperation and rage. The guards froze, their eyes widening in shock. For years, the heiress had been silent, unable to make a sound, and now she stood trembling, her voice ragged but alive. The janitor stared at her in disbelief, his chest tightening as tears stung his eyes. She had done it. She had spoken. Not through machines, not through science, but through their secret nights, through human touch. The commotion drew more attention. Servants peered from corners and whispers spread like wildfire through the palace. The heiress clutched the janitor's arm, screaming again, this time shaping the broken sounds into something that almost resembled words. The guards, unsure of how to act, dragged the human to his feet, declaring he had broken sacred law, that no servant, least of all a human, was allowed to touch the heiress. But her cries continued, echoing down the halls, her first sounds carrying further than any rumor could. When her father was told, his fury shook the palace. Tyrax Valor summoned his daughter and the janitor to the great chamber, his eyes burning with humiliation and rage. To him, it was a scandal beyond measure. His silent daughter, the shame he had hidden from the galaxy, had now been exposed, but not by alien science or wealth, by a human janitor. To Tyrax, it was an insult that cut deeper than any blade. He declared that the human would be executed, that his audacity would be punished with death. The council murmured in agreement, their voices dripping with disdain for humanity. But the heiress stood trembling in the center of the chamber, her fists clenched, her scars burning with memory. And before the council could silence her, she raised her voice once more. Broken, imperfect, but filled with strength, she shouted. It was not just a cry. It was speech, her first words in a galaxy that believed she would never utter a sound. The chamber froze. The council stared in disbelief. Tyrax himself faltered, his rage momentarily silenced by the impossible. The heiress's voice cracked the walls of silence that had surrounded her since birth, and it carried only one desperate truth, that the human had given her what no empire could. And the galaxy, for the first time, began to realize that something greater than wealth or power had awakened within its heart. The trial of the janitor. The chamber of judgment was vast, carved from black stone that shimmered faintly under the glow of alien energy orbs. It was here that the most powerful beings of the Orion conglomerate gathered to decide matters of honor, power, and law. Tonight, the chamber pulsed with anger and whispers. A human janitor had been brought in chains, dragged across the floor by guards whose expressions radiated disgust. Around him, the council sat upon their thrones, their robes glittering with jewels and their voices hissing like serpents. Above them all sat Tyrax Valor, the billionaire lord of the conglomerate, his face carved into fury, his eyes fixed on the man who had dared to touch what was his. The janitor stood silently, his wrists bound, his back aching from the rough treatment. He did not look at the council, nor at the lords who sneered at him. His eyes searched only for the heiress. She stood near her father, her delicate figure trembling but her chin raised, her luminous eyes locked on him with defiance. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but fear flickered across her face, for she knew her voice was still weak, broken, and untrained. Yet even so she stepped forward, standing between him and the council, her body trembling with the weight of her courage. The council began their accusations. They spoke of law, of tradition, of the insult that a human servant had dared touch the heiress of the conglomerate. They called it a crime of violation, a disgrace that demanded punishment by death. They spoke with venom, their voices dripping with hatred for humans, whom they saw as weak, pitiful creatures, unworthy of the stars. Some even demanded the janitor's body be displayed as a warning to others who might forget their place. But before the council could declare its verdict, the heiress raised her hand. For a moment the chamber fell into silence, the lords watching with confusion, and then, with trembling breath, she forced out broken sounds. At first, it was only fragments, cracked syllables that echoed harshly through the chamber. Many of the lords laughed, thinking it was madness. But then her voice grew louder, her words clearer. She pointed to the janitor, her voice breaking but filled with fire, and declared that it was he who had given her sound. The chamber gasped. For the first time in history, the silent heiress had spoken, not through alien science, not through machines, but through a human's touch. Her father's face darkened with rage. He rose from his throne, his robes billowing like a storm. "Lies," he thundered, his voice shaking the chamber. He called her desperate, claimed she had been deceived, said no human could achieve what the galaxy's greatest minds had failed to do. He demanded silence from her, but she refused. She clutched her chest, her voice cracking as she forced out another word. "Truth," she cried, her voice imperfect but undeniable. The chamber erupted into chaos. The janitor, still bound, felt his chest tighten with pride and fear. He had not wanted this. He had only wanted to give her a fragment of what she had been denied. Yet now, because of him, she stood in defiance of her father, risking everything. He wanted to tell her to stop, to protect herself, but he could not speak. His voice, his freedom, had been taken from him by chains. The council argued loudly, their voices clashing. Some claimed it was a miracle, others a trick, others demanded proof. Finally, one of the elder lords demanded that the heiress show them. With shaking hands, she reached for the janitor. The guards tried to push her back, but she shouted, clearer this time, "No!" The word rang across the chamber, silencing even the lords. Her voice was broken, yes, but it was strong enough to stop an empire. She moved forward, forcing the guards aside, and touched his bound hand, pressing it to her ear. The council leaned forward, their jeweled eyes gleaming with disbelief. For a moment, nothing happened. And then her face lit up, her eyes filling with tears as she gasped audibly. The chamber shook with the sound of her first true laugh, faint and broken but unmistakably real. The lords fell silent. No one could deny it. The heiress turned, her voice cracking as she forced another word, looking at her father with fierce determination. "Father," she whispered, not in title, not as an heiress of his empire, but as a daughter desperate to be heard. Her voice was imperfect, her speech broken, but in that single word was a truth that shattered every law, every prejudice, every ounce of pride in the chamber. Tyrax Valor's face turned pale, his fury colliding with disbelief. For all his wealth, his fleets, his armies, he had never been able to give her this. And yet a human, a lowly janitor, had done what no empire could. His pride screamed to deny it, But his heart, buried deep beneath his armor of power, trembled. His daughter's voice was the one thing he had prayed for and the one thing he had given up on. And now it was before him, carried not by his empire but by the hands of a forgotten human. The council erupted in argument. Some demanded the janitor's release, declaring that to punish him would dishonor the miracle. Others still cried for his death, too blinded by hatred to accept the truth. The chamber became a battlefield of voices, but none louder than the heiress's broken words. Each time she forced out a syllable, each time her voice cracked, the chains of silence that had bound her life broke further. The janitor bowed his head, his eyes wet. He did not care if they killed him. In that moment, hearing her voice, seeing her courage, was enough. If this was to be his last day, he would die knowing he had given something no empire could buy. But fate was not finished with him yet. For in the silence that followed her last trembling word, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. The council could no longer deny what had been witnessed. And though his chains remained heavy, the janitor knew that the trial was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about something greater. It was about humanity proving itself in a galaxy that had forgotten the strength of the human spirit. The legend is born. The chamber of judgment had fallen into silence after the heiress's final trembling word. It was not the silence of ignorance anymore, not the crushing void she had lived with since birth. This was a silence filled with awe, the silence that follows a miracle. The council sat frozen, their jeweled robes forgotten, their pride shattered by the sound of a voice they had once sworn would never exist. Even Tyrax Vaylor, the great billionaire lord whose wealth could buy entire moons, whose fleets could bring empires to their knees, now stood still like a man struck by lightning. His daughter had spoken, not because of him, not because of alien science, but because of a human. The janitor stood bound in chains, his body bruised and his face shadowed by exhaustion. Yet, in that moment, he looked taller than any lord in the chamber. He had not spoken a word, but the truth was carved across the room. Every alien, every noble, every guard knew that what they had just witnessed could never be erased. He had given the heiress what no empire could. He had given her sound, her first breath of voice, and in doing so he had broken the arrogance of an entire galaxy. The council erupted in chaos. Some shouted that the human must still die, claiming it was a dangerous accident, a trick that would spread disorder among the stars. Others argued that to punish him would dishonor the heiress's miracle. Voices clashed like thunder, but none carried the weight of hers. The heiress stepped forward again, her delicate figure trembling but her spirit blazing. She forced her voice to rise, broken syllables tearing from her throat as she repeated the word she had given the council. Truth. Her voice cracked, but its power silenced them all. She then turned, her glowing eyes locked on the janitor, and shaped another word, clearer, stronger this time. Father. The chamber gasped. She did not speak to her biological father, the lord who had hidden her away in shame. She spoke to the human, the janitor who had given her what no alien ever had. In that single word, she declared him something far greater than a servant. She gave him honor before the galaxy. The lords shifted uneasily in their seats, realizing history was being written before their eyes. Tyrax Vaylor's face twisted with conflict. His pride screamed at him to condemn the human, to erase this insult with blood. But his heart, hardened by years of power, cracked when he heard his daughter's voice. All his wealth, his armies, his knowledge, none of it had given her this. And now, for the first time, she had called another man father. The sound of it shook him more than any war ever had. He lowered his head, unable to speak, and for the first time in decades, Tyrax Vaylor felt powerless. The council, unable to deny the truth, finally declared the human spared. The decision did not come from mercy, nor from respect, but from fear of the legend that had just been born. They could not erase what the galaxy would now whisper, that a human, a lowly janitor, had achieved what no alien empire could. The guards unlocked his chains, and the heavy iron fell to the floor with a ringing echo that carried like a victory song through the chamber. The janitor did not raise his fists in triumph. He did not smile with pride. Instead, he looked wherever she went. He was with her, and the palace servants, the guards, even the council bowed when they passed, for they knew the galaxy had changed. As for Tyrax Vaylor, he never spoke of the humiliation, but neither did he defy the truth. He accepted that his daughter's first voice had come not through his empire, but through the touch of a human. It was a wound to his pride, but also a gift to his heart. In his quiet moments when no one watched, he would stand outside his daughter's chambers and listen to her broken words. And though he would never admit it, tears sometimes burned his eyes. Thus, a new legend was born, not of armies or fleets, not of wealth or power, but of a human janitor whose hands carried the strength of the eternal human spirit. In a galaxy that had once mocked humanity, this story became a torch. And every time the Heiress spoke, every time her voice echoed across the halls, the galaxy remembered that it was a human who had given her the world.